A single sentence from Austin Reaves during what was supposed to be a routine morning interview just detonated across the entire NBA landscape, and by the time the segment was over, one analyst on the ESPN panel literally said out loud, "I don't think Rob Pelinka is watching this and staying quiet. There's no way." The topic was supposed to be simple, Reaves calling in from Luka Dončić's Slovenia minicamp to talk about team chemistry heading into training camp, but within about 4 minutes the conversation completely fell off the rails because Reaves went on the record with a level of frustration toward his own front office that nobody in that studio was even remotely prepared for. Stay with me until the end, because this debate ends up covering everything from the Rui Hachimura fallout to the stalled Jonathan Kuminga negotiation to a genuinely uncomfortable moment where the entire panel had to acknowledge that a max contract player just publicly aired his laundry about the man who signed his checks less than 2 months ago. Let's rewind exactly how this started, because the context matters enormously. Reaves was calling in from Ljubljana, where Luka has hosted 16 of the 17 roster players for a 4-day team bonding minicamp. The interview opened light, questions about the golf outings, sightseeing, what it was like being welcomed into Luka's hometown, standard stuff. Then one of the anchors asked a completely reasonable follow-up question about whether the group feels finished heading into training camp, or whether there's still one more move the roster is waiting on. That's when Reaves gave the answer that lit the entire segment on fire. According to the transcript that's already circulating everywhere, Reaves paused for what one analyst described as at least 3 uncomfortable seconds before saying, and I'm paraphrasing here to stay accurate, that everyone in the locker room loves the guys who came in, but that certain decisions this offseason didn't reflect what the players had actually communicated to the front office, and that he thought Rui Hachimura should still be on this roster given what he meant to the group both on and off the floor. He didn't stop there. He then said, and this is the line that immediately became the entire story, that at some point the guys who actually play the games need to be listened to more than the guys who watch them from the 3rd row of the arena. The reaction inside the studio was immediate and honestly a little chaotic. One analyst physically leaned back in his chair and said something along the lines of, "Did he just say what I think he said?" Another analyst tried to soften the interpretation, suggesting Reaves was speaking generally about front offices across the league, not specifically about Rob Pelinka, but the third voice on the panel wasn't having any of that damage control, immediately pointing out that Reaves was speaking directly about his own team, from his own team's minicamp, having just referenced his own team's departed teammate by name. There was zero ambiguity about who the target was, and pretending otherwise was going to embarrass everyone at the desk. Then came the breakdown that really escalated things. One analyst pulled up the specific reporting from earlier this summer that Rui Hachimura was reportedly on Luka Dončić's preferred return list, and that the Lakers front office made a conscious decision to let him walk to the Clippers in favor of adding more defensive versatility to the wing rotation. According to this analyst, if that reporting was accurate and Reaves is now publicly confirming that the locker room agreed with Luka's preference, that creates a genuinely alarming disconnect between the players and the front office heading into what's supposed to be the first real season of the Luka era in Los Angeles. But the pushback was immediate and pointed. Another analyst on the panel argued that this is exactly the kind of noise that gets manufactured every single offseason by players who are frustrated their friends got moved, and that it says nothing meaningful about the actual construction of the roster. The Lakers, according to this rebuttal, made a series of objectively defensible moves. They brought back Reaves on a max contract. They finally solved the center problem by trading for Walker Kessler. They added real perimeter defense in Matisse Thybulle and Quentin Grimes. They added shot creation with Colin Sexton. And they did all of that while working with essentially no cap flexibility beyond the mid-level exception. That's not incompetence. That's competent roster construction under genuinely difficult financial constraints. And blaming Rob Pelinka for not being able to conjure a two-way starting small forward out of thin air is fundamentally unreasonable given the resources actually available to him. That's when the conversation shifted directly to the Jonathan Kuminga situation, because you simply cannot separate what Reaves said from the fact that the Lakers have been publicly pursuing Kuminga for weeks without closing the deal. According to one analyst, the Kuminga stalemate is exactly the kind of situation where a player publicly signaling frustration might actually be a coordinated pressure tactic, an attempt to get the front office to move faster and more aggressively on completing that final piece of the roster before training camp opens. If Reaves is essentially telling ownership on national television that the players want Kuminga in the building, that's not accidental, that's calculated leverage. The counter to that theory was equally sharp. Another voice on the panel argued that even if that interpretation is correct, it's a genuinely dangerous precedent for a player in year one of a nearly $200 million contract to publicly pressure his own general manager through the media. That's exactly the kind of dynamic that historically destroys locker rooms once it starts, and the fact that Reaves apparently felt comfortable doing it this early in his new deal suggests something more fundamental about the internal power structure of the organization has already shifted in a way that Rob Pelinka might not fully appreciate yet. Then the panel got into what I think was actually the most interesting angle of the entire debate, which is what all of this says about Luka Dončić's role in the situation. One analyst argued forcefully that there's simply no way Reaves goes on national television and says what he just said without at least tacit approval from the alpha of the locker room, and in this new post-LeBron era, that alpha is unquestionably Luka. If Luka wanted Rui back and didn't get him, and Luka wants Kuminga added and hasn't gotten him, then having his second-in-command deliver that message publicly through the media is exactly the kind of soft power play that superstars have used to influence front office behavior for decades in this league. The rebuttal was that this reading gives Luka way too much credit for calculated media manipulation. Luka has consistently been described throughout his career as someone who cares deeply about basketball and almost nothing about the political machinery of the league, and projecting some elaborate coordinated pressure campaign onto him and Reaves probably says more about the media's need for narrative than about what's actually happening inside that Slovenia minicamp. Now here's my honest take on this entire genuinely wild segment, because I think there's a lot more going on here than just one player venting into a hot microphone. First, I actually think the substance of what Reaves said is largely defensible if you strip away the political implications. Rui Hachimura was a real contributor for this team. He was well liked in the locker room, and losing him to a division rival specifically for salary and defensive versatility reasons is exactly the kind of move players often struggle to fully rationalize even when they understand it intellectually. Reaves being sad about losing a friend and teammate isn't a scandal, it's just human. Where things get significantly more complicated is the timing and the platform. Airing that frustration on ESPN from a nationally visible team bonding event while your team is still actively negotiating with another target, that's not just emotional processing, that's a strategic communication whether Reaves intended it that way or not. And the fact that he apparently didn't clear it with the organization first, at least based on how completely blindsided the studio anchors seemed by the direction of the interview, tells you something important about how Reaves views his own standing within the franchise now that he's signed his second big contract. He clearly believes he has the political capital to say things publicly that most other players in his position wouldn't dare to say without permission, and whether that assessment is correct or not, it's going to be tested very quickly once he's actually back on US soil facing Rob Pelinka directly. I also want to address the Kuminga angle, because I think it's genuinely the most important underlying storyline here. The Lakers have been dragging their feet on that negotiation for weeks now, and every single day that passes without resolution creates additional locker room anxiety about whether the roster is actually complete, or whether the franchise is going to walk into training camp with an obvious hole at the wing that everyone can see from a mile away. If Reaves' comments accelerate that negotiation, either by pushing Pelinka to sweeten the offer, or by pushing Kuminga to accept the current terms just to end the drama, then this whole controversy actually ends up being productive rather than destructive. But if the negotiation continues to stall even after this public pressure, then the disconnect between what the players want and what the front office is actually delivering becomes significantly harder to paper over. The Rob Pelinka question is the one I keep coming back to as I process this. Pelinka has genuinely done impressive work this offseason under real constraints, absorbing the LeBron departure, retaining Reaves on a favorable long-term deal, solving the center problem, and adding legitimate role players around Luka without completely mortgaging the future. But the perception problem is real, and perception in the NBA eventually becomes reality if it isn't actively managed. If Luka's public leader within the locker room is willing to go on national television and question the front office's decision-making this early in the era, that's not a small crack. That's a structural issue that requires immediate attention before it grows into something significantly worse over the course of an 82-game season. There's also a broader angle here worth exploring about how the modern NBA superstar era actually works when it comes to roster construction. In previous decades, general managers had significantly more autonomy to make personnel decisions based on their own evaluation, with player input treated as a courtesy rather than a genuine veto. That dynamic has completely inverted over the past 10 to 15 years, to the point where certain superstars now effectively co-manage their own rosters, with front offices treating their preferences as mandatory rather than optional. The Lakers under LeBron James operated in that model for 8 straight seasons, with LeBron's input treated as effectively binding on major roster decisions throughout his tenure. What we might be watching right now is the awkward transition period where the front office is trying to reassert genuine autonomy under a new superstar dynamic, and the superstar's allies are pushing back publicly to re-establish the pre-existing power structure. If that's actually what's happening beneath the surface of what Reaves said this morning, then this becomes a genuinely fascinating organizational chess match that's going to define how the Lakers operate for the next several years. Rob Pelinka either successfully asserts that the front office runs the roster with input from players, or he cedes that authority back to the star and effectively becomes an executor of Luka's preferences rather than an independent decision maker. There's no comfortable middle ground in a situation like this once it becomes public, because everyone involved is now being watched by every other franchise in the league to see how the dynamic actually resolves. There's one more layer to consider before wrapping up, and it involves the specific timing of this controversy relative to training camp. Camp opens in about 6 weeks, which means there's just enough time for this to either fully blow over with some quiet apologies and clarifications, or for it to metastasize into a genuine full-blown organizational crisis if Rob Pelinka responds publicly in any way that Reaves or Luka interpret as disrespectful. First-year head coach JJ Redick, who just signed his extension, is now going to be caught in the middle of whatever this becomes, and how he navigates that mediation role might end up defining his entire second season on the job. If he sides too visibly with the front office, he risks losing credibility with his star players. If he sides too visibly with the players, he risks alienating the executive who just extended his contract. That's an incredibly difficult political situation for any coach to navigate, let alone one who's still relatively early in his own head coaching career.